There's a moment in every civilization when the foundations shake. When the comfortable illusions we've built around safety, order, and human nature begin to crack. And in that moment, leaders face an ancient choice. Do you rule through the warm embrace of love, hoping people will choose to follow? Or do you understand what philosophers have whispered for centuries, that true stability demands something colder, something sharper, something that cuts deeper than affection ever could? Most people believe in fairy tales. They think societies hold together because we all agree to be nice to each other. They imagine that democracy works because citizens wake up each morning choosing to respect laws, honor contracts, and treat strangers with dignity. They see love as the glue that binds communities, the force that makes sacrifice meaningful, the emotion that transforms strangers into neighbors. But this is the thinking of children. And children don't understand power. The uncomfortable truth is this: fear doesn't just maintain order, it creates it. Not the chaotic fear of violence or uncertainty, but the calculated fear of consequence. The fear of what happens when the system stops protecting you. The fear of what lurks beneath the surface when civility breaks down. Because love, for all its beauty, for all its inspiration, has one fatal flaw. It's voluntary. And voluntary systems collapse the moment people stop volunteering. Think about your own life. When do you actually follow rules? When you love the person who made them. When you feel warm and connected to the institution enforcing them. Or when you understand, somewhere deep in your bones, that breaking them will cost you something you can't afford to lose. Be honest. When you pay your taxes, stop at red lights, show up to work, honor your debts. Are you moved by love for the government, for traffic laws, for your employer, for your creditors? Or are you moved by the quiet knowledge that the alternative is worse? This isn't cynicism. It's recognition of how human beings actually operate when the stakes are real. Love inspires. Fear stabilizes. Love creates moments of transcendence. Fear creates systems that survive when the inspiration fades. And every stable society in history has understood this balance, even if they've been too polite to say it out loud. But here's where it gets dangerous. Because acknowledging that fear works doesn't mean embracing tyranny. The most sophisticated forms of power understand that the best fear is invisible. It doesn't announce itself with jackboots and midnight arrests. It operates through structure, through consequence, through the simple understanding that actions have prices and someone, somewhere, is always keeping score. Consider the architecture of any functional society. Laws exist not because we love them, but because we fear the chaos that would emerge without them. Courts function not because judges inspire affection, but because everyone understands they possess the power to reshape lives with a single decision. Contracts hold not because parties feel warm toward each other, but because breaking them triggers mechanisms that no rational person wants to face. Even in relationships, the ones that endure aren't held together by love alone. They're maintained by the fear of loss, the fear of being alone, the fear of starting over, the fear of disappointing people who matter. Love brings people together. Fear keeps them there when love isn't enough. And anyone who's lived through the collapse of a marriage, a friendship, or a business partnership knows that love without consequence is just a beautiful way to get hurt. This is why the question isn't whether fear or love is better. The question is which one you can control. Love depends on the other person's choice. It requires them to feel something specific toward you, something that can change without warning, something that exists entirely outside your influence. But fear you can architect. Fear you can predict. Fear responds to systems, to structures, to calculated pressure applied at precisely the right moments. The great political philosophers understood this instinctively. They saw that societies built purely on affection were societies built on sand. Because affection fades, gratitude expires, goodwill evaporates under pressure. But consequences endure. The fear of those consequences shapes behavior even when no one is watching, even when the feeling has long since died. This creates a paradox that most people never resolve. The systems that protect love require fear to function. The institutions that enable kindness must be backed by force. The societies that celebrate compassion need mechanisms that punish those who prey on the compassionate. You can't have gentle communities without harsh boundaries. You can't have trust without the ability to punish betrayal. You can't have cooperation without the power to destroy those who refuse to cooperate. But there's a deeper layer here, something more psychological than political. Fear doesn't just control behavior. It shapes identity. When someone knows that certain actions will trigger certain consequences, they begin to internalize those limits. They stop seeing rules as external impositions and start seeing them as natural boundaries. The fear becomes invisible because it becomes part of their internal architecture. This is how stable societies actually work. Not through constant monitoring or visible threats, but through the slow, steady process of making certain behaviors literally unthinkable. People don't avoid murder because they love their neighbors. They avoid it because the concept has become so associated with catastrophic consequences that it doesn't register as an option. The fear has become so deeply embedded that it operates below conscious awareness, and this is where love-based systems reveal their fundamental weakness. Love requires constant maintenance. It needs feeding, nurturing, validation. It demands attention and energy and emotional labor. But fear, once properly installed, maintains itself. It operates in the background like a well-designed program, shaping choices without requiring conscious effort. Consider what happens during crisis, when resources become scarce, when pressure mounts, when survival is at stake. Do people rally around shared affection? Do they sacrifice for the common good out of love for their community? Sometimes. For a while. Until the crisis deepens and the stakes get higher and love starts to feel like a luxury they can't afford. But systems built on fear don't collapse under pressure. They reveal their true strength. Because fear scales with stakes. The more dangerous the situation becomes, the more people need the protection that only stable institutions can provide. The more chaos threatens, the more valuable order becomes. Fear-based stability doesn't break down during crisis. It becomes more necessary. This is why every enduring civilization has learned to make fear invisible but inescapable. They've discovered how to create consequences that shape behavior without feeling oppressive. They've mastered the art of making compliance feel like choice, while ensuring that non-compliance carries costs no rational person would accept. The societies that survive aren't the ones that inspire the most love. They're the ones that make defection impossible to imagine. They create systems where breaking the rules doesn't just carry punishment. It carries social death, economic suicide, psychological isolation. They make loyalty feel voluntary while making disloyalty literally unthinkable. And here's the crucial insight. This doesn't require brutality. It doesn't demand visible oppression. The most effective fear is the kind people impose on themselves, the kind that operates through internalized consequences, through social pressure, through the simple understanding that certain behaviors lead to certain outcomes and smart people don't test those boundaries. This is the architecture of real power. Not the crude force of dictators, but the subtle pressure of systems that make alternatives disappear. Systems that don't tell people what to think, but make certain thoughts too costly to maintain. Systems that don't demand love, but make its absence irrelevant. Because in the end, stability isn't about making people happy. It's about making chaos impossible. And chaos becomes impossible not through inspiration, but through the quiet, persistent understanding that some lines simply cannot be crossed, that some consequences are too severe to risk, that some fears are too fundamental to ignore. The question isn't whether this is right or wrong. The question is whether it's true. And if it is true, then everything we think we know about power, about society, about human nature itself, needs to be reconsidered from the ground up. Look at how this plays out in the real world. Every parent discovers this truth eventually. You start with love, with reasoning, with appeals to your child's better nature. You explain why hitting their sister is wrong, why lying breaks trust, why responsibility matters. And for a while, if you're lucky, love seems to work. But then comes the moment when love isn't enough. When explanation fails. When your child looks you in the eye and chooses defiance anyway. That's when you learn what every parent learns. That boundaries without consequences are just suggestions. That rules without enforcement are just wishes. That love without the ability to impose limits is just permissiveness dressed up in noble language. The children who thrive aren't the ones whose parents love the most. They're the ones whose parents understand that love must be backed by structure, that affection must be reinforced by accountability. This same dynamic scales up through every level of human organization. Look at any workplace. The employees who perform aren't motivated by love for their boss or passion for the company mission. They're motivated by the understanding that performance has consequences, that showing up late, missing deadlines, or delivering shoddy work will trigger responses they'd prefer to avoid. The most effective managers aren't the most beloved. They're the ones who create clear expectations and consistent follow-through. Even in intimate relationships, this pattern holds. The couples who last aren't necessarily the ones who feel the deepest passion. They're the ones who understand that certain behaviors will damage something they can't afford to lose. The fear of destroying the relationship creates boundaries that love alone could never maintain. The fear of being alone, of disappointing someone who matters, of facing the consequences of betrayal. These fears create the structure within which love can actually flourish. But here's where most people get confused. They think acknowledging fear means abandoning love. They imagine that recognizing the role of consequences somehow diminishes the importance of affection. This is backwards thinking. Fear doesn't compete with love. It protects it. Fear creates the conditions where love becomes possible, where trust can develop, where vulnerability doesn't equal victimization. Consider what happens in societies that try to operate purely on love, that eliminate consequences in the name of compassion, that refuse to acknowledge that some people will always choose to exploit kindness if no price is attached to that choice. These societies don't become more loving, they become more chaotic, because predators understand what idealists refuse to accept. That undefended kindness is just opportunity wearing a different mask. The drug epidemics, the homelessness crises, the breakdown of basic civic norms. These aren't failures of love. They're failures of structure. They happen when societies become so afraid of seeming harsh that they stop maintaining the boundaries that make genuine compassion possible. When fear of being judgmental becomes more powerful than fear of enabling destruction, this is the paradox that destroys well-intentioned communities. In trying to create spaces of pure love, they eliminate the very mechanisms that could protect the vulnerable from the predatory. They create environments where the most ruthless actors face no meaningful consequences, while the most decent people bear all the costs. The result isn't more love, it's less. Because love cannot survive in environments where exploitation carries no price. The successful societies understand this balance instinctively. They create what appears to be voluntary compliance while making non-compliance genuinely costly. They build systems where good behavior feels natural because bad behavior has been made systematically disadvantageous. They don't eliminate fear. They channel it toward productive ends. Look at how reputation works in functional communities. People behave well not because they love everyone around them, but because they understand that their reputations affects everything from business opportunities to social relationships to marriage prospects. The fear of social consequences creates incentives for trustworthy behavior that no amount of preaching about love could achieve. This is why small towns often have better social cohesion than large cities. Not because small town people are more loving, but because in small towns, consequences are inescapable. Everyone knows everyone. Bad behavior follows you. Trust, once broken, affects every future interaction. The fear of permanent damage to your standing creates powerful incentives for decent behavior. Cities, by contrast, offer anonymity, the ability to escape consequences, to start fresh, to avoid accountability. This freedom sounds liberating, but it often produces the opposite of liberation. It creates environments where trust becomes impossible, where cooperation breaks down, where people must constantly guard against exploitation. Because the systems that normally discourage exploitation don't function. The most sophisticated societies solve this by scaling up the mechanisms that make consequences inescapable. They create credit systems, background checks, professional licensing, digital records, networks of accountability that follow people across geography and time. They make it impossible to escape the consequences of your choices by making those consequences systemic rather than personal. This isn't oppression. It's architecture, the architecture of trust. Because trust doesn't emerge from good intentions. It emerges from reliable consequences, from systems that make betrayal too costly and cooperation too beneficial to ignore. The fear of losing access to these systems creates powerful incentives for trustworthy behavior that individual relationships could never provide. But there's something even deeper happening here, something that touches the core of human psychology. Fear doesn't just modify behavior, it shapes perception. When people understand that certain actions carry certain consequences, they begin to see those actions differently. What once seemed possible starts to feel impossible. What once seemed reasonable starts to feel absurd. This is how stable societies actually change behavior at scale. Not through education or inspiration, but through the slow process of making certain choices literally unthinkable. People don't avoid corruption because they love integrity. They avoid it because corruption has become associated with such severe consequences that it doesn't register as an option. The societies that endure are the ones that master this psychological transformation. They create environments where the right choices feel natural, not because people have been convinced they're right, but because the wrong choices have become too costly to contemplate. The fear operates below conscious awareness, shaping decisions before rational analysis even begins. And this reveals something crucial about human nature that most people refuse to acknowledge. We're not primarily rational creatures, motivated by abstract principles. We're adaptive creatures, motivated by consequences. We don't choose behaviors because we've reasoned our way to them. We choose them because we've learned, through experience or observation, which choices lead to outcomes we want and which lead to outcomes we want to avoid. This is why appeals to conscience, to better angels, to shared values so often fail to change behavior at scale. Not because people lack conscience, but because conscience without consequence is just internal noise. People can rationalize almost anything when the external costs are manageable. But they can't rationalize behaviors that threaten their fundamental security, their social standing, their ability to function in the systems they depend on. The implications of this understanding extend far beyond politics or governance. They touch every aspect of how we organize human cooperation. From families to corporations to international relations, the same dynamic applies. Stability emerges not from mutual affection, but from mutual vulnerability to consequences that no one wants to face. This creates a framework that most people find disturbing because it challenges their most cherished beliefs about human goodness and social progress. They want to believe that civilization advances through growing empathy, expanding love, deeper understanding between peoples. They imagine that conflict arises from misunderstanding and that peace emerges from better communication. But this is the mythology of the comfortable, the luxury thinking of people who've never watched systems collapse in real time. The brutal reality is that every advance in human cooperation has been built on increasingly sophisticated systems of mutual assured destruction. Not the obvious kind involving nuclear weapons, but the subtle kind involving reputation, economic interdependence, social exclusion, and institutional memory. The more civilized we become, the more elaborate our mechanisms for making betrayal catastrophically expensive. Consider how international trade actually functions. Countries don't honor agreements because they love each other or share values. They honor agreements because breaking them triggers trade wars, economic isolation, diplomatic consequences that can devastate entire populations. The fear of being cut off from global systems creates incentives for cooperation that no amount of cultural exchange could achieve. Even humanitarian aid operates on this principle. Nations provide disaster relief not primarily from compassion, but from the understanding that failing to do so damages their international standing, affects their ability to build coalitions, weakens their influence when they need support. The fear of isolation creates behaviors that look altruistic, but are actually strategic. This pattern repeats at every scale. Professional associations maintain standards not through appeals to ethics, but through the power to revoke licenses, end careers, destroy reputations. Religious communities maintain cohesion not through shared belief alone, but through the threat of excommunication, social exile, spiritual consequences. Academic institutions maintain rigor not through love of learning, but through the ability to grant or withhold credentials that determine entire life trajectories. The genius of these systems is their invisibility. People experience them as natural, as voluntary, as expressions of their own values. But remove the consequences and watch how quickly the behavior changes. Remove the ability to revoke professional licenses and see how many professionals maintain their standards. Remove the threat of social exile and observe how many community members continue following social norms. Remove academic consequences and witness how many students pursue actual learning versus grade optimization. This reveals something profound about the difference between compliance and commitment. People think they're committed to their values, their relationships, their responsibilities, but most of what they experience as commitment is actually sophisticated compliance with systems of consequence they've internalized so completely they no longer notice them operating. The test comes during crisis, when those systems begin to break down, when professional associations lose their power to enforce standards, when social communities fragment and exile becomes meaningless, when academic credentials lose their value and learning becomes purely optional. In these moments, you discover who was truly committed and who was simply responding to invisible pressure. History is littered with societies that discovered this distinction too late. Communities that believed their cohesion came from shared values, only to watch those values evaporate the moment the enforcement mechanisms weakened. Nations that thought their citizens' loyalty was based on patriotism, only to see that loyalty dissolve when the state could no longer provide protection or consequences. The Roman Empire understood this dynamic better than most. They didn't rule through love of Roman culture, though they certainly promoted that. They ruled through the systematic creation of consequences that made rebellion literally unthinkable. Roman citizenship wasn't just an identity. It was access to legal protection, economic opportunity, social status that existed nowhere else. Losing it meant losing everything that made life worth living. The fear of exclusion created loyalty that cultural propaganda alone could never achieve. But even Rome made the fatal error that destroys all systems built on fear. They began to believe their own mythology. They started thinking that people followed Roman law because they loved Roman justice, that they participated in Roman culture because they admired Roman values, that they served in Roman legions because they felt patriotic toward Rome. As the empire expanded and the consequences became less personal, less immediate, less inescapable, the compliance began to look voluntary, and voluntary compliance, as we've established, is just delayed rebellion. This is the trap that catches every successful system eventually. Success creates distance between actions and consequences. Distance makes consequences feel optional. Optional consequences create testing behavior. Testing behavior reveals the gap between actual commitment and fear-based compliance. And once that gap becomes visible, the system begins its inevitable collapse. Modern democracies are experiencing this phenomenon in real time. For generations, democratic norms held not because citizens loved democracy in the abstract, but because violating those norms carried social, economic, and political costs that no rational actor would accept. But as society has become more complex, more anonymous, more forgiving of norm violations, those consequences have weakened. Politicians test boundaries that previous generations considered untouchable. Citizens ignore civic responsibilities that once carried real shame. Institutions fail to enforce standards they once protected ruthlessly. The result isn't more freedom, it's more chaos. Because systems don't become more loving when they become less fearsome. They become more exploitable. The people who thrive in consequence-free environments aren't the most virtuous. They're the most ruthless, the most willing to take advantage of others' continued compliance with norms they themselves have abandoned. This creates a death spiral that well-intentioned people never see coming. They interpret the breakdown of fear-based systems as progress toward love-based alternatives. They imagine that reducing consequences will create space for more authentic cooperation. They believe that eliminating the threat of punishment will allow people's better nature to emerge. But what actually emerges is predation disguised as liberation. Look at what happens in communities that eliminate consequences in the name of compassion. Crime rates don't decrease because criminals discover their inner goodness. They increase because criminals discover that their behavior no longer carries meaningful costs. Educational standards don't improve because students become more intrinsically motivated. They collapse Because students optimize for the new reality where effort and achievement are disconnected. Social cohesion doesn't strengthen because people feel more free to be authentic. It fragments because antisocial behavior faces no meaningful resistance. The people who suffer most in these situations aren't the ones who were oppressed by the previous system of consequences. They're the ones who were protected by it. The vulnerable, the honest, the people who continued following rules even when the enforcement disappeared. They become prey for those who understand that consequence-free environments are hunting grounds for the unscrupulous. This is why every attempt to build utopia through the elimination of fear creates dystopia through the empowerment of predators. Not because the vision is wrong, but because the psychology is backwards. Human beings don't become more cooperative when consequences disappear. They become more tribal, more exploitative, more focused on short-term advantage at the expense of long-term stability. The societies that actually achieve something resembling the utopian vision do so through the opposite approach. They create such elegant, comprehensive, inescapable systems of consequence that cooperation becomes the only rational choice. They make trustworthy behavior so advantageous and untrustworthy behavior so catastrophically expensive that people internalize cooperation as natural law. These systems don't feel oppressive because they don't need to be. When the consequences are systematic rather than personal, predictable rather than arbitrary, proportional rather than excessive, people experience them as justice rather than tyranny. They feel protected by the system rather than threatened by it. But that protection depends entirely on the system's ability to impose costs on those who would exploit others' cooperation. This brings us to perhaps the most uncomfortable truth about human nature and social organization. The capacity for love, for genuine altruism, for self-sacrifice in service of others, these exist. They're real. They're beautiful. They represent the highest potential of human consciousness. But they're also fragile, context-dependent, and utterly helpless against systematic exploitation unless they're protected by systems of consequence that make such exploitation impossible to sustain. The choice isn't between love and fear. The choice is between love protected by fear and love destroyed by predation. Between cooperation enforced by consequence and cooperation exploited by defection. Between trust backed by accountability and trust betrayed by those who understand that trustworthy people make ideal victims when no price is attached to victimization. This is the framework that explains why every stable society in history has learned to make fear invisible but inescapable, voluntary in experience but systematic in operation. They've discovered that the alternative isn't more love, it's less. Because love cannot survive in environments where loving behavior is systematically disadvantaged by those who understand that consequences are the only thing standing between civilization and chaos. So here we stand at the edge of an uncomfortable recognition. The fairy tale is over. The myth that societies hold together through mutual affection, that stability emerges from shared goodwill, that human cooperation is sustained by love alone. These comfortable illusions dissolve under scrutiny. What remains is a truth that cuts through every layer of wishful thinking about human nature and social order. Fear is not the enemy of love. It is love's guardian. Not the crude fear of tyranny, but the sophisticated fear of consequence that makes trust possible, vulnerability safe, and cooperation sustainable. The societies that endure don't inspire the most affection. They architect the most elegant systems of accountability. They create environments where the right choices feel natural because the wrong choices have become unthinkable. This doesn't make us monsters. It makes us human. Creatures who need structure to flourish, boundaries to feel safe, consequences to guide our choices. The most loving parents understand this. The most successful communities practice this. The most stable civilizations have always known this, even when they were too polite to say it out loud. The question is no longer whether this is true. The question is what you'll do with this knowledge. Will you continue believing that good intentions are enough? That explanation can replace enforcement? That systems can survive on voluntary compliance? Or will you begin building the invisible architecture that makes the world you want to live in actually possible? Because in the end, the choice isn't between fear and love. It's between systems that work and systems that collapse under the weight of their own idealism. And only one of those options creates the stability where love can truly flourish.